Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. This is Joseph Trevisani performing a sound check for FX Street in today's webinar. We will be bringing up the video in a few seconds, and we will start in about 5 minutes. Thank you for your patience. Hi, everybody. This is Joseph Trevisani of FX Solutions. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. I apologize for the delay, but I had to reload the HotCom software. So we are back. Everyone should see a chart, a standard Euro chart. If you've been to my webinars before, you know this is pretty standard. You see one every time. So it looks like we're ready to go. Okay, the topic today is something which did not get a great deal of press in the West. It was mentioned and then ignored. I think it deserves a good deal more. That's why I've written some things about it, and we'll talk about it for a bit today. We have had, in fact, a very interesting day in the currency markets. Take a look. We are from almost 41.50 2 days ago to 45.50 today. That's, in fact, a four-figure move. That is the type of move that we saw when the Fed announced their QE policy. So it is a huge comment on what's going on in the markets right now. I think the biggest reason for that is probably the successful bond sales of the, I think it was the Spanish and the Greek. It wasn't so much that they did such a great job. It's that they didn't have a collapse, that it wasn't undersubscribed. In fact, it was oversubscribed. And we're talking about small amounts, $4.9 billion, $5 billion in Spanish, and about 1.3, if I remember, in the Greek. The Spanish rate was a little bit lower than expected, and that must have been an enormous relief for everybody. But on to the BRIC summit. I was asked to appear on one of the TV shows here last week, and I wrote this up in thinking about that because the topic was, in fact, on that show, which I couldn't go. The last summit, the BRIC summit, BRIC was a term, I think we all know it by now, BRIC, alternative spelling without the K, stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China. This particular summit was in South Africa. It was held in China, in the southern part of China. There has long been suspicion, some of it public, so it's not suspicion, it's an actual statement, that these countries would like to change the world's financial system. The question is why? Right now, we can look at it and say, well, they're worried about the dollar going down. That's true. But the dollar goes down and the dollar goes up. And you never hear complaints when the dollar is high and the values of their holdings are rising. They added BRICs for this particular summit. The term is simply a term created by somebody at Goldman, I believe. I think Jim, forget his last name. So the term is just a term. There is no BRIC this or BRIC that. It's not like the G20, which has an actual organization or anything like that. But they did invite South Africa this last time. Reasons? I'm not really sure, to tell you the truth. At any rate, the goal, well, to backtrack a little bit, the U.S. possession of the world reserve currency is something we've spoken about over the past couple of years a number of times. It gives the U.S. a very decided advantage. There was an interesting, although I think false, erroneous analysis done by James Fellows. He is a writer for the Atlantic magazine here. He's probably also a fellowship, probably belongs to a think tank or something or other. And his point was that the U.S. cannot default on its debt because it can always print more dollars. That's true, of course. But it's also a very, very myopic view of what would really happen. If the U.S. started wholesale. Now it's denying, of course, that it's doing. Printing of dollars to pay off its debt, it creates vast amounts of inflation. Well, what would happen if that occurred? People would demand, just take a look at Greece right now. Greece has kept said it's not going to default. Well, then why is the 2-year rate on Greek money over 20%? Why is the 10-year at 15%? Because the market thinks they will default, or they think it's a very high possibility. So what do they demand in return? A very high interest rate. And remember, as I said before, the real question for this is not new issuance. It's really for the secondary market, for the trading in existing Greek debt right now. So yes, Mr. Fellows, who should know better, is right. The U.S. won't default as long as Congress raises, of course, the debt limit and permits the government to borrow more money. It won't default, and it can't default, because it'll just print more dollars. However, the U.S. has an enormous debt load. It is rising astronomically and practically geometrically underneath the current administration, who seems to have no other plans for the American economy than to run trillion-dollar deficits every single year. Well, a traditional way of governments of getting out from under their debt is to inflate it away. Wrecks the economy, but gets them out from under it. So, that's what will happen. And again, Mr. Fellows should know this. By narrowing and just saying the U.S. can't default, he makes a very, how shall I say, specious argument. Yes, it's true, but it doesn't mean there won't be any results, and they won't be damaging. The U.S. is now borrowing money for 2 years less than 1%. It's a nice rate. For 10 years, it's paying 3.4%, 3.3%, whatever it is today. That will not last if the market gets wind of permanent monetization policy. They'll be paying 6 and 7% for that kind of money. And that will put an enormous burden. I've seen some of these figures on the U.S. economy as far as interest payments go. So yes, Mr. Fellows is right. The U.S. can't default. But it's a childish point to make. Greece hasn't defaulted either. But look what it has to pay for money. So back to the BRICs. There are a couple of interesting facts about this. Most of them are political. The point that I made to the TV producers was that the main thrust behind the BRIC point of view is political. It's really not economic. The reserve currency in the dollar, as long as the world has relative faith in it, gives the U.S. an enormous amount of undeserved financial power. I looked up on Wikipedia recently how many aircraft carriers are running around the world. The U.S. has 11 carrier battle groups. It's a lot. The next nearest nation, I would put it up for a guess, but I know nobody will ever guess. And most of those carriers are all 100,000 tons. There's 50, 60 planes. The next nearest carrier, possessor, is, believe it or not, Italy. Italy has 2 what are called short takeoff and landing carriers of about 20,000 tons each. Nobody else has more than 1. That includes Russia. That includes China, who has been rebuilding a Ukrainian carrier, I think, which is really Russian, from the last age. So no one can project power the way the United States can, period. Not even close. That's great. Makes it very useful. How are those carriers going to be paid for when they wear out? When the planes need to be replaced? The current administration is borrowing a third, actually more than a third, of its budget. The U.S. takes in about $2 trillion in taxes and other fees. The governments is spending $3.6 trillion, I believe, in the current fiscal year. The assets of the military and so many other things in the United States are considered, I would consider them now, wasting assets. They can't be replaced when they wear out. And that is why, and so the political strength that accrues to the United States from the ability to support, up until now, that kind of military establishment is one that is much envied by our competitors. And make no mistake, Russia is a competitor. China is a competitor, both politically and militarily. Brazil is economically. India is to some degree, but it's friendlier. At least it has a more congenial type of government as being the largest functioning democracy in the world. Because the world is willing to lend the U.S. that much money, it is able to support this type of expenditure. Its result of owning the dollar is political power beyond the measure to pay for it. If you'd like a comparison, look at Britain after the Second World War. 50 years before, Britain was the preeminent power in the world. But its economy had already started to slip. Its economy had no longer produced the amount of money necessary to maintain that establishment. After 2 world wars, there was nothing left. Britain didn't just retreat from empire. It retreated at top speed. Partially, one could say mostly, because it couldn't afford it anymore. The collapse of the economic base in Britain and of its efficiency and ability to produce tax revenue is what drove. There were many other things involved too, and certainly the times had changed, and the colonized were no longer content to remain colonies. But Britain's economic decline spurred its political decline. When you can no longer pay for the instruments of power, they go away, they wear out, and the political power soon follows. It is the dollar right now, and people's willingness to invest in it and to lend the U.S. money, that gives the U.S. this ability. So the financial aspect of it, it's borrowed money now, gives political power. China is looking to the future of Asia, to its future in Asia. The dominant military power in Asia is not China. It's the United States. It's the United States carrier battle groups, among other things. China's view on that is not one that will permit them, I think, to tolerate that for many years to come. After all, the Taiwan Straits between China and Taiwan are dominated by the U.S., not the 7th Fleet, the Pacific Fleet. I think it's the 7th Fleet. That would be the same as if the waters between and Taiwan, I believe, is about 30 miles, I'd have to check, off the coast. It might be a little more, maybe it's 50 miles. That would be as if the Chinese fleet dominated. Because remember, China considers Taiwan a province, even if it's a separate government. That would be if the Chinese Pacific Fleet dominated the waters between Hawaii and the United States, a much greater expanse. Unlikely that's something the Chinese are going to tolerate for a long time. But right now, it is the dollar that permits this to be, because people are still willing to lend to the U.S. money. And the primary reason is because the world's finances are still denominated in dollars. There is a certain degree of hypocrisy on this as well, because the countries that are complaining about this have, and are moving on it now, have made an effort to diversify out of U.S. dollars. The problem is, of course, there's really no place else to go. So, let us look at the BRICs more in particular. China, India, and Brazil I don't think, Carlos, I don't think Britain has a 400 external debt to GDP ratio. I'd have to check that. A country with any amount of debt ratio can continue to function as long as people are willing to lend it money, either internally or externally. That's how. Does this go on forever? No. Okay, if that's including, that's not external debt, that must be total debt, not just government debt. That must be all private debt as well. And the two are usually separated. What's usually is government debt to GDP that's looked at. I mean, if you look at all the debt in the United States, it's far beyond the percentage that is considered now. That's just outstanding government debt, T-bills and stuff like that. If you start including unfunded mandates, if you include all the government IOUs that are sitting in the Social Security Fund, I mean, the administration has been saying, I think it was Geithner, I'm not sure, that that Social Security is fully funded. It's funded with government IOUs. There's no bank balances there. The money you paid was long ago taken by the federal government for other purposes, and what it put into the Social Security Fund were IOUs. So it's not really funded. There's no cash there. Anyway, I will speak to that about in a little bit. So these are rising countries in the world, and the current world financial system dates from the end of the Second World War. The World Bank, IMF system, and the world financial system is still dominated by the United States. And it serves Western and United States interests, political interests, as well as financial interests. And that I think is the key point for all of these countries. It reflects far less of their interests and needs than they would like. The needs of the Russian government and the Russian politics, international politics, are not congruent with those of the United States and Britain and France and Eastern Europe. Not by their own definitions. The same is true of China, and to a lesser degree also of Brazil and India. For Brazil and India, the differences, I think, are more financial and economic as far as competition goes than they are political. Brazil, at least as far as I know, does not seem to have any international political aspirations beyond furthering its own economic growth. India, that's not true. India has fought wars with China and with Pakistan, and India has international political concerns and ambitions. But with China, her interests are largely, well, not largely, but are not disparate, different than ours. So anyway, these countries as rising countries, perhaps for different reasons, and I'll talk to Zebra. Thank you for that. That is the total debt, correct? That's not government debt. Ours is probably as high as that or higher. Excuse me, there's somebody at my door. So this is an attempt. These countries all, for different reasons, have... Interesting. Thank you for that, Zebra. I'd like to look at those figures. U.S. debt clock. I'll take a look at that when I'm done and see what's actually included in that. I doubt that includes the amount of unfunded pensions that are outstanding in the U.S. I also doubt that it includes the IOUs that are sitting in, just as an example, as I mentioned, in Social Security. Because the current debt is rising on 60%, and that's just outstanding government debt. There's a lot more debt in the United States than that. There's nothing like fantasy bookkeeping, huh? I wish I could do it. Anyway, I mean, I've said it before, and many other people have said it as well. If the generally accepted counting standards applied as a legal term to the way the government keeps its books, everybody probably down to the local dog catcher would be in jail, because the government has the worst type of accounting imaginable. It makes Enron look like the most successful and careful firm imaginable. And this is true factually. I mean, it's just ridiculous what they're able to do. Anyway, on from that. I didn't mean to get onto that. So, in the post-war history, the current world financial system, as reflected in the IMF, the World Bank, the whole financial system serves Western interests, and it was created by the West. It does not serve Russian interests by and large. They use it because that's what's there. They have to. It certainly does not serve Chinese interests. The Chinese economy has been successful enough and strong enough so that they have, in many ways, simply ignored what they didn't want to pay attention to, what they didn't care about. The primary example of that is, of course, the yuan. It's very difficult to tell your banker what to do. And the West has been uniformly unsuccessful. And I have said this time and time again over the past couple of years, that China will only revalue and appreciate the yuan when it serves her own purpose. There was a headline, front page article on the Journal, either yesterday or today, saying exactly that China is perhaps moving to the idea that upward valuing the yuan will help it with inflation. Yes, it probably would. It would help it with a lot of problems. But the issue is it may, in the short run, take jobs from China and send them to India. It may send them to Sri Lanka. It'll send them to Vietnam. At some point, it may send them to Ireland and Greece as well, maybe even the United States. Yes, China permitted last year for limited use of the yuan as an external currency for settling deals. You know, I remember reading in the 19th century, the U.S. and Argentina did a grain deal. And I think I mentioned this the last webinar, and the grain deal was priced and paid in pound sterling. Same thing here. As long as the U.S. retains its preeminent position in the world, and people believe in the faith and credit of the U.S., then the dollar will remain the world's reserve currency simply because it already is, and because it is an enormous efficiency. But if the U.S. does not, and if the U.S. does not get a hold of its debt and its fantasy bookkeeping, then it will not, then you will end up probably with a multipolar system. And China has taken, if you will, the first step for that. They're permitting, and look who they're doing it with. They're doing it with the rising powers, the rising economic powers. Brazil. Brazil is the perfect example of the difference that a government, and so is China, that a government can make, both positively and negatively. Brazil was badly ruled for years. China for 200 years. And look at the difference now. The difference is government policy. China under Mao was fantastically unsuccessful economically. Probably some of the biggest famines in the history of the world were caused by Mao's economic policy. New government, new difference. Same with Brazil. Under Fernando Cardoso, and then I cannot pronounce his name, but I like his nickname, Lula, and the current president, whose name I do not remember, it has been a well-ruled country, largely devoted to growing the economy, because growing the economy, thank you, Dilma, thank you very much. It's a woman I know, because its point of view was that if you want to bring people out of poverty, and Brazil has a lot of poverty, what you need to do is create wealth. Not redistribute your existing wealth, but create new wealth. And that's what the United States has been doing for 200 years, and many of the other capitalist countries in the world. China, another example. That's what you need to do, and that's the tact that they took. China largely got the government out of the way. That's exactly right. That is one of the most astonishing things. But then again, you had Deng Xiaoping, a veteran of the Long March, turning China into a capitalist country. Because they both realized that only now, Lula inherited a system that was moving in the right direction, put there by Fernando Cardoso. Nonetheless, he spurred it along and did it, and had 8 fantastically successful years, and I think is viewed that way both overseas and in Brazil. Good question. I don't. So that's what, $430 billion? That's 500 million. Yeah, that's $430 billion. No, doesn't matter that much because our debt is trillions. But anyway, the point being here that these countries are moving in a direction. China is not signing yuan agreements with the States. It does more trade with the United States than with Brazil. So why is it not signing it with the United States? Because its purpose is political. And the purpose of this BRIC, that's exactly right. Albert, you're absolutely correct. If you want to bring people out of poverty, you must create wealth. Period. Communism proved beyond any doubt that type of economic organization of a country does not produce wealth. There isn't anything to say about it beyond that, is because accepted that it's been proven. It's not a theoretical fact, it's been proven. When you let people create wealth, they seem naturally to do so. People actually prefer, Sophie Tucker said that, I've been rich and I've been poor, and believe me, rich is better. When freed, there seems to be, now it would be too far, and I would be enraging perhaps any progressives out there to say that there is a natural human inclination towards capitalism, but I will say so anyway because I think it's probably true. Because capitalism both permits you to operate as an individual, and it gives you a chance at least to create wealth on your own. That is something which is much more restricted in other types of systems. I read a story actually of it's repeated in several Roman authors, of a man who invented an unbreakable type of glass in the Emperor Tiberius' time, which is sometime about Tiberius, in the 1st century A.D. And he brought it to the emperor, expecting to be funded or perhaps rewarded. The emperor asked him if anyone else knew of the secret, and he said no, only he knew it. And Tiberius promptly cut off his head because that knowledge would have undermined the economic system of the time. The same was true of imperial China. You needed licenses after license, and they looked very, very dimly on economic or technological innovation. Top-down bureaucratic systems that the Romans had less in the beginning but developed under the empire, and China for thousands of years under their imperial system, stifle innovation, they stifle growth, they stifle wealth creation. In fact, they try and do away with it. So that's the difference between what we saw in... I think I told the story. When I was in Egypt last year, I asked a tour guide, young, very attractive woman who took me to the pyramids, whether she would not like to form her own tour company and start a business. And what she said, forgive me if I told this story before, I think I did. And she said, it would cost me, we did the calculation quickly, $500,000 in licenses to start a simple tour guide business. Now, even if she's exaggerating by a factor of 5, or I did the math wrong in the back of the car, even if it was 100,000, even if it was 50,000, a factor of 10, it was a complete block on her starting a business. That kind of control is what is so frustrating and must be so frustrating to the people of trade and exchange. Has a long, long history throughout Islamic cultures. It was Islamic traders who brought Islam to Indonesia in the 13th and the 14th century. But the current governments there are nothing more than bureaucratic nightmares. India used to be called the license Raj. You needed so many licenses to get anything done. As they did away with that, so the economy started to grow. Yes, I'm being very successfully admonished to get back on topic. I will, sorry. Let us return to the BRICS. And I'll answer all these questions. Listen, folks, I love the comments and the questions that are up there, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. I will refuse. Carlos, I thank you for that comment, but it is beyond my job level, my grade level, to comment on it, though I do agree with you. So let me go back to the BRICS. And I'll get to these things, but let me go through the topic first, since that's what you're all here for. You're not here to hear my stories about Egypt. Although that type of authoritarian control is common throughout the Middle East, and it's one of the greatest impediments to wealth for their people. And maybe whatever current government evolves in Egypt will take the path of China and India rather than the path of Iran on economics. That remains to be seen, as they say in journalism. So it is natural for countries that are rising, economically rising, to want to create international institutions that reflect both their values and promote their interests. And that is the basic thrust behind the BRIC, or the BRIC countries. The current system supports a different worldview, different interests, and they're looking to create an alternative to it. This is a natural function. There is a second, and perhaps more timely, although I think less long-term view, and that is, and this is a very credible view, that in the view of the BRIC countries and many others, and many other people in the United States as well, the U.S. is badly mismanaging its finances and the dollar. And that is a real threat to the world financial system, and I think that is true. The most likely occurrence here, as S&P said recently, they are making now, the administration poo-pooed what the S&P said. S&P said that its judgment was on the political will in Washington to make a sensible and long-term beneficial, an agreement that will solve, or at least go a long way towards creating a solution to the U.S. debt problem. I know I've heard from, not heard from, but you can read a number of columnists, Robert Reich, Paul Krugman. What? Me worry. There's no problem here. And that, of course, is not true. There is no problem until suddenly there is one. Your credit card is no problem, no matter how much you put on it, until the bank cuts the credit line. Then it suddenly is a big problem. That's exactly what the U.S. is looking at. So that mismanagement, and as China and Russia, who have been more vocal about it because they are competitors to the United States and they see no real reason to mince their words. Brazil and India less so, although Brazil had some pretty harsh comments quite recently. India less so, but they all take the same view, that if there are serious problems with the world financial system because of what the U.S. is doing, they don't want their economies to get caught in the collapse. And that is a very sensible long-term point of view. So the two, I think, coincide in the current view. The natural inclination of rising nations to foster political international organizations that support their interests and their point of view, and two, the current mismanagement coming, I would say colossal mismanagement coming out of the politics in Washington. It has yet to be proven that democratic systems can maintain over time fiscal probity. I won't say that any other systems have a much better record. Certainly, aristocratic systems do not. Autocratic systems, some of them, autocratic governments may. So there's really no one who can, certainly communist governments have no ability to say that their system promotes better financial management. And that includes the Chinese as well. The Chinese are in a growing stage. They are where the United States was after the Civil War, or where Britain was in the early part of the 19th century. Things are easy when the economy is in that condition. It is not easy once the economy has become mature. The Germans, there are governments out there that maintain fiscal sense. The Germans are one. But the Germans are the preeminent exporter in the world. Okay, so let us move on now. We covered the history of this. The G7, the G8, the G20, include them in the IMF, ex-Bretton, former Bretton Woods, World Bank, Davos, all that stuff, where all the financial and political elites, I don't get invited, by the way, get to go and party and talk to everybody and bring their assistants and do God knows on the government dole, mostly, and on private expenditures. Lovely, lovely gig if you can get it. I'm sure it was a good deal like hanging around Versailles when the Sun King was ruling there. It must have been a lot of fun. And there must have been lots of opportunities for lots of fun. Yes, you have to talk to the media every once in a while and appear serious, but I think that you're talking mostly major partying. But since I don't know, I don't go, I don't know. At the level of this, yeah, I didn't go either. At the level of these organizations, the G7, now the G8, the G20, politics is always the main topic. And finance's purpose and economics is to support the political endeavors. So, of course, everything involved in this has been to the, yes, I do. I just sold our Jetta, and I will buy another German car. There's no doubt about that. The West, and all of these nations deigned to invite the others to come, but that's pointless because the organizations still represent Western interests, not Chinese, not Indian, not Brazilian. They represent the interests of their founders, and that is not going to change. So it is natural for these nations to look for a different support system for their own politics. Okay, on to the BRICS. Boyke, apologize for that. I'll just read you a few of the points that I sent to the producers of the Kudlow Show last week. The dollar in the world financial system. It doesn't matter whether the public plan of the BRICS summit is to end or supplant the dollar's central role in the economy. And they say that they're not, but of course they are. To achieve their political goal, and that's the point, the BRICS must gradually diminish the dollar's central role in the world financial system. That serves a twofold purpose. It permits them to expand the use and acceptance of their own currencies, and it diminishes the U.S. ability to fund itself beyond what it's willing to pay for. The dollar's value to the U.S. is essentially political. and I've made this point before, it permits the U.S. to fund itself far beyond what it is willing to pay for out of its own pocket. The dollar permits the U.S. to live well beyond its financial means. Now, diminishing the dollar's role, that is something that would and has been going on as far as transactions go, except for two major purposes and two major things which hold it back. One, still the dollar is viewed as, and dollar assets as the world's chief holder of long-term financial value. And the reason for that is one, because it always has, at least in the modern world, post-World War II, and two, because the U.S. has the deepest, the largest, the most liquid financial markets. If you need to offload a few $1 billion of something, the only place you can really do it easily and then get out of it to United States financial markets. Now that will change and has been changing, but that takes a long time. And so that is one thing which has supported what the U.S. has done all this time. Yes, I'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing is that most of the world's commodities are priced in dollars, and therefore you have a very long, if you will, financial tradition of what's going on. It's very difficult to get people. Yes, perhaps that's true. We'll have to talk to Maud about that, since I suppose the monthly webinars are longer. Anyway, so let me now talk briefly about the dollar and the role of inflation. And yes, I think another thing that is exciting, or the interest of the BRICS, is that they look at the U.S. financial position. They look at Washington, and they see years and years of monetization. Not only does that undermine the value of their own assets, which it does, but I don't think that's the chief concern. I think the chief concern is that it drives up commodity prices and inflation around the world, and that is a domestic concern for all of these nations, especially the ones that don't produce oil or other commodities. China being one. Brazil is both and Russia both get a benefit and suffer from it. India also as well, although less. I think they probably suffer it more. If you look at the Middle East, one of the factors behind what's going on there is certainly the rise in oil prices. This is not demand driven. Yes, there is higher demand. We've spoken of this. And this is the other concern, that if this goes on, if you have a government that is planning, yes, I'll bet they are. If you have a government that is planning a decade's worth of trillion-dollar deficits every year, what is the end result of that going to be? I mean, this is high school economics. The U.S. is going to print dollars to cover those deficits, and they're all going to flood out into the world, as they're doing now. Now, I know the Fed is denying that. I don't believe it. It'll be interesting to see, and everyone watch, at the end of next week, when, and I have to write something for FX Street on that, I have not forgotten, and I'll do it today. Mr. Bernanke is holding a news conference. Now, most journalists are not great on finance. They're not great on international economics. They're really not. The only thing they're good on are the political positions, the one that they came with. But there will be some people who will ask reasonable, intelligent questions at that press conference. Last topic, BRIC vulnerabilities, and then we'll end on this because I know we're getting very close to the end. The natural inclinations of the BRIC countries are, I think, far limited. Carlos, I actually don't know the answer to that, and I will look it up. I believe the peso is actually a floating currency in the world. It's just not traded very much. That's what I think. There are major problems in this supposed BRIC arrangement. One, it takes a very long time and a great deal of financial strength and dominance to create the organizations that are currently in the world serving the Western interests. And as successful as they are, these countries that we're talking about at the BRICS do not have anywhere near that type of ability, that type of strength. Nor, and this is more importantly, do they have a uniform world outlook. At the end of the Second World War, the outlook of the United States and the victors in the war, the French, the de Gaulle's government, and the British, and the Canadians and everyone else, yes, Vicky, I will, is they have a unified worldview. They're all democracies. Germany became a democracy very quickly. Japan became a democracy very quickly. So there was a real congruence. They all had the same types of governments. They all were promoting the same type of economic systems. So there's a natural affinity there between those countries, which extended long before the Second World War, actually, in many cases, certainly on the economic system. That's certainly not true on the political side for the BRICs. Brazil, so far, hasn't really had any international systems, and they have a history of authoritarian military rule. China is not a democracy and doesn't seem to be in a hurry to turn one, and India is. India and China have fought a number of wars. India lives in, as they say, a tough neighborhood. China less so because it's such a dominant country. So it'll be very difficult for these nations to create the type of organizations that the U.S. did at the end of the Second World War. And don't forget, the U.S. created those organizations at a very unusual time, the end of the Second World War. There were no competitors to U.S. power anywhere. Period. Nothing. Nowhere on the horizon was there a power that compared economically or politically to the United States at the end of the Second World War. That is an extremely unusual situation in history. So, just based on that, we can say that the BRIC countries are not going to be anywhere, have any degree of success with that standard to create these type of institutions. However, and I will put one caveat with this, what we were looking at the end of the Second World War was a war. What it is possible is that there is a financial catastrophe that could also produce a similar type of change in world power. This happened, if you take not the American example, but the British example. If you take the British example as a nation from the end of the 19th century for the next 50 years, then you have an example of a nation and a world system to some degree that collapsed, and British influence collapsed because it started with a financial change, which also started in a war. Okay. Let me just give you my closing points on this. Whether or not the U.S. is on the scene in Asia, the naturally competitive positions of China, Russia, and India will not change. Russia and China compete in the Far East. India and China compete in Central Asia and around the subcontinent. That's not going to change whether the U.S. is there or not. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the decline of U.S. dominance would make their competition all the more likely. Russia's Far East is loaded in resources and very thinly populated. China is just south of it, needs resources, and is not thinly populated at all. So right there, you can say that if the U.S. retreats, and it is retreating, it's going to, unless it decides to fix its economic problems, you will have a world that is becoming not a different world, but you'll have not a new power, but you will end up with a multipolar world, which is in fact normally the political history of the world is multipolar. There are only, meaning many centers of power of varying strengths. There is bad news for world stability. I agree 100%. The most stable times are when you have an imperial power or an imperial system that dominates. So as the U.S. power retreats, I think you will have more, not less competition. There is no real natural affinity except in opposition amongst these powers. So I do not think you're going to get a new system based on this. I do have to quit. I know they warned me. Boyke, I hope that was helpful. A lot of this has been written up on our Facebook page and my various posts over the past week and a half. I have a column titled Some Thoughts on the BRIC Summit, Brazil, and Others, which you can check out on our website. I thank you all very much for attending. I'm sorry if it was a little scattered today, but I hope it was enjoyable. We need to do some more traveling here. Maybe it's time to go back to Egypt so we can come back with some more stories. Again, thank you all very much. Thank FX Solutions and Maud, of course, for their efforts. And not only Maud, there's Elena, I believe. I apologize for not pronouncing the name correctly. And we will see you next month. Take care, everybody.